6 months had passed since the evacuation, and Ambassador Yoon Seo-jin stood once again at the viewport of her diplomatic shuttle as Nexus Prime came into view. The station looked the same as it had before, and silver, and elegant, and eternal, but everything else had changed. Lieutenant Bae Sun-woo guided the shuttle toward the docking arm, and he moved with more confidence now, and something had shifted in him during those desperate months. Something had shifted in all of them. Ambassador, Sun-woo said, "The council is already assembled and they are waiting for you." Seo-jin nodded and straightened her uniform, and noticed for the first time how much weight she had lost during the crisis. Sleep had been rare, and food had been an afterthought. And there had always been another problem to solve, and another refugee settlement to coordinate, and another grieving family to comfort. 3.2 billion people now lived in human territory, and Thracians and Corvan and Netheri and others, who had been pulled from the jaws of the swarm. Integrating them had been the challenge of a lifetime, and human colonies had opened their doors and shared their resources and built new communities from nothing. It had not been easy, and tensions had flared, and cultural misunderstandings had caused friction, and resources had been stretched to breaking. But they had managed, and somehow and together. The shuttle docked, and Seo-jin walked the familiar corridors of Nexus Prime, and this time, the other species did not look at her with dismissal or condescension. A Valari diplomat bowed as she passed, and his skin flickering with colors of deep respect. A Kethri warrior stepped aside and performed a gesture she did not recognize, but understood instinctively as honor. Even the Nethari guards at the council chamber entrance dipped their antennae in acknowledgement. Seo-jin entered the great circular room, and 17 species waited on their platforms, and the chamber fell silent. As she took her place, High Arbiter Thyssen rose from his central position, and his luminous body shimmered with colors more complex than any she had seen before. "Ambassador Seo-jin," he announced, and his voice carrying through the chamber. "The Galactic Confederation formally requests that you address this council." It was unprecedented, and junior members did not receive formal requests to speak, and they waited until called. Upon Seo-jin stood and looked around at the assembled delegates, and so many faces, and so many species, and so much history in this room, High Arbiter. She began, "6 months ago, I stood in this chamber and proposed an evacuation that this council declared impossible. Today I stand before you with the results of that operation." She activated her datapad and projected statistics into the center of the room. 3.2 billion colonists, evacuated from 14 worlds and currently housed in human territory and receiving food and shelter and medical care and education for their children. The numbers hung in the air and undeniable. And impossible and true, 211 human vessels were destroyed during evacuation operations, and 3,427 human volunteers gave their lives. She paused and let those numbers settle into the consciousness of every delegate. They were cargo pilots and miners and retired teachers and university students and grandparents who had never fired a weapon in their lives. They flew into the path of the swarm because they believed that no life should be abandoned and no people should be left to die alone. Commander Drovik shifted on his platform, and his scales had changed color since their last meeting, and something in his bearing suggested discomfort. "Ambassador," Thyssen said carefully, "the Council acknowledges the extraordinary nature of humanity's actions, and we also acknowledge that our decision not to provide support was a mistake." Seo-jin inclined her head. "I did not come here to condemn the Council's choice. I arbiter, and I came here to discuss what happens next. The Varak swarm consumed the outer colonies as expected, but they found them empty, and the biomass they needed to fuel their expansion was not there." She adjusted her projection to show tactical data. "Intelligence reports indicate that the swarm's advance has stalled, and they are consolidating in the outer territories, and their momentum is broken. You created a resource vacuum." Drovic observed, and grudging respect in his translated voice. Yes, Commander. And the swarm expected to consume billions and use that energy to push deeper into Confederation space. Instead, they found empty worlds, and their advance has cost them more than it gained. The implications rippled through the chamber, and species exchanged glances as they processed what this meant. The swarm is vulnerable. Seojin continued. For the first time in recorded history, the Virax have overextended themselves, and they lack the resources to maintain their current territory and push forward simultaneously. She pulled up new projections and fleet movements, and tactical assessments and strategic recommendations. Humanity proposes a joint offensive, and we strike now while the swarm is weakened, and we push them back from the outer territories entirely. You want us to attack? A Thracian delegate asked, and hope warring with fear in his rumbling voice. I want us to win. Seojin replied. The defensive strategy was sound for preservation, but it would have meant accepting the swarm as a permanent threat. This is our chance to eliminate that threat forever. Silence fell over the chamber, and the weight of the decision pressed down on every delegate. High Arbiter. Thiessen rose to his full height, and his colors shifted to the deep purple of formal proceedings. Commander Drovic, you are our military strategist, and what is your assessment of the human proposal? Drovic studied the tactical projections for a long moment, and his forearms folded across his chest. The plan has merit, he admitted. If we commit significant forces now, we could theoretically drive the swarm back to their original territory. But, Thiessen prompted, but it will require the Confederation to trust human tactical judgment and to follow their lead in combat operations. He turned to face Seojin directly. 6 months ago, I called your evacuation plan tactically absurd, and I was wrong, and 3 billion lives were saved because of your tactical absurdity. He performed the Kethri gesture of profound respect, and his armored arms crossing in a pattern Seojin had only read about. I will follow your lead, Ambassador. And if you say we can defeat the swarm, then I believe you. One by one, the other delegates added their voices, and Thracians, who owed their survival to human sacrifice, and Nithari, who had watched their neighbors rescued by strangers, and Valari, who had witnessed something that changed their understanding of civilization. The vote was unanimous, and for the first time in history, the Galactic Confederation committed to an offensive operation led by humanity. Seojin accepted their support with quiet dignity, and inside she felt the weight of 3,000 lives that had made this moment possible. After the session concluded, Thiessen approached her privately, and his colors muted to shades of personal conversation. Ambassador, I have lived for 3 centuries, and I have seen species rise and fall, and I have watched civilizations make choices that defined them for eternity. He paused and seemed to struggle with words his translator could barely convey. When you walked out of this chamber 6 months ago, I thought you were naive, and I thought you did not understand how the galaxy worked. I understand now that we were the naive ones, and we have forgotten that survival without principle is merely existence. Seojin thought of Admiral Park, and they volunteers, and the grandmother who flew her yacht into a Vorax cruiser, and the university student who worked until he collapsed, and all the ordinary humans who had chosen to be extraordinary. High Arbiter. Humanity did not do anything special, and we simply refused to accept that mathematics could determine the value of a life. Thiessen's colors flickered with something like wonder. And that, Ambassador, is precisely why the galaxy will never forget what your species has done. Seojin bowed respectfully and turned to leave the chamber outside. The stars waited, and beyond them the Virax swarm lurked in conquered territory, and the greatest battle in galactic history was about to begin. But humanity would not face it alone, and never again would any species look at the young race from that violent death world and see anything less than equals. They had walked out of the War Council and returned to change the galaxy forever. And this was only the beginning. The human fleet assembled at the edge of contested space, and over 4,000 ships hung in formation against the endless dark Admiral Park. Ji-hoon stood on the bridge of the carrier used Defiance and watched the chaos of civilian vessels trying to organize themselves into something resembling a military formation. It was beautiful and terrifying and completely unprecedented. Admiral, his communications officer reported, "We have ships still arriving from the outer settlements, and the current count is 4,312 vessels. Crew complement? Approximately 62,000 volunteers, sir. 62,000 ordinary people, and cargo pilots and miners and cruise ship captains and retired grandparents, and university students, and all of them here to save strangers." Park had never been prouder or more afraid in his entire life, Lieutenant Commander. Cha Minji approached with a datapad, and her expression troubled. "Sir, we have a logistics problem, and many of these civilian ships lack compatible communication systems, and coordinating the fleet will be extremely difficult. We expected that." "Commander, I know, sir, but the Varak scouts have been detected 3 systems away, and we have less time than we thought." Park nodded and turned to address his bridge crew. "Signal all ships to begin phase 1 and military vessels take point, and civilian transports follow in convoy formation, and we make for colony. Theta 7 first." The fleet lurched into motion, and it moved nothing like the precise formations Park had commanded in naval exercises. Ships drifted out of alignment, and communication channels crackled with confused queries, and somewhere a mining barge nearly collided with a passenger liner. But they moved, and 4,000 ships carrying the desperate hope of humanity pushed forward into the danger zone. The first colony appeared on sensors after 2 days of travel, and Theta 7 was a Thracian agricultural world, and 300 million people lived in its farming communities. Park studied the tactical display, and Varak scouts had been spotted in the neighboring system, and they had perhaps 40 hours before the main swarm arrived. "Begin evacuation procedures," he ordered. "All civilian transports descend to the surface, and military ships establish a defensive perimeter." The next 40 hours became a blur of controlled chaos. Cargo haulers that normally carried grain and machinery now packed their holds, with frightened families and children clutched toys as they boarded ships they had never seen before, and elderly Thracians wept as they left the only homes they had ever known. The human volunteers worked without rest, and pilots flew shuttle after shuttle from surface to orbit, and crews converted cargo spaces into temporary shelters, and medics treated the injured and traumatized. Park watched the evacuation numbers climb, and 100 million, and then 150 million, and then 200 million. "Admiral," his sensor officer called out in fear edging into her voice. Varak scouts entering the system. The tactical display showed 12 small vessels emerging from subspace, and their organic hulls gleaming with the sickly bioluminescence that marked swarm ships. "They are scanning the planet," Minji reported, confirming biomass concentration and transmitting coordinates to the main swarm. "How long until the swarm arrives?" "Approximately 6 hours, sir," Park calculated quickly, "and at current evacuation rates they could save perhaps another 50 million before they had to retreat. Signal all transports to accelerate loading, and we leave in 5 hours, whether everyone is aboard or not." The evacuation intensified, and shuttle pilots flew reckless patterns through the atmosphere, and cargo ships descended to landing zones that were barely suitable, and every second counted. Then the scouts attacked the 12 Varak's vessels, dove toward the evacuation zone, and their weapons targeted the defenseless civilian ships. Park had positioned his military forces for exactly this moment. "All combat ships engage," he commanded. "Protect the transports at all costs." The U.S. Defiance led the charge, and its weapons blazing against the organic scout ships, and fighter squadrons swarmed to intercept the enemy. The battle was brief but bloody, and 3 human military vessels were destroyed, and 47 crew members died in the first exchange, but the scouts were eliminated and the evacuation continued. 4 hours remaining. Minji announced. The numbers kept climbing in 250 million evacuated, and then 270 million, and then the main swarm appeared on sensors. Thousands of contacts. The sensor officer whispered, and her face pale with horror. They are coming. Park looked at the evacuation status, and they had saved 287 million Thracians and 30 million more remained on the surface. Signal all ships to withdraw. He ordered, and each word cutting like a knife. We cannot save everyone. Sir, Minji said quietly. I know. The fleet retreated and behind them 30 million. Thracians watched the human ships disappear, and the Varak swarm descended upon their world. Park stood at the viewport and watched Colony Theta 7 shrink in the distance, and somewhere down there, people were dying because he could not save them all. Set course for the next colony. He said, Admiral, the fleet has taken significant damage, and we have lost 9 ships in total, and crew morale is fragile. I know, Commander, and set course for the next colony. The evacuation continued, and colony after colony and world after world, and each time the same desperate race against the swarm. A 73-year-old grandmother named Song Yunji piloted her touring yacht directly into a Varak's cruiser that was targeting a refugee transport, and her ship was vaporized, but the transport escaped with 8,000 people aboard. A mining crew from the asteroid belts used their industrial cutting lasers to slice through a swarm vessel's hull, and they died when the ship exploded, but they took the enemy with them. University student named Jiang Minho flew communications relay duty for 16 hours straight, and when his ship was damaged, he transferred to another vessel and kept working until he collapsed from exhaustion. The Confederation sent observers to monitor the human operation, and their footage was transmitted back to Nexus Prime in real time. The War Council watched in silence as humans died by the hundreds to save species that were not their own. How many casualties? High Arbiter Thiessen asked. 217 human vessels destroyed. His aide reported approximately 3,000 confirmed deaths with more expected. And how many colonists have they evacuated? Current estimates suggest over 2 billion across 9 worlds. High Arbiter. The sand's colors flickered through. Emotions that had no names, and he had lived for 3 centuries and thought he understood the nature of civilized species. He had been wrong on the bridge of the Defiance. Admiral Park received word that the final colony had been cleared, and the last refugees were aboard, and the fleet could finally retreat to safety. He should have felt relief, but he could only think of the faces he had seen on those worlds, and the people reaching toward ships that could not carry them all, and the children crying for parents who had stayed behind. How many? He asked. Final count is 3.2 billion evacuees. Admiral, across 14 colony worlds. 3.2 billion lives saved, and 400 million left behind, and over 3,000 human volunteers dead. Park closed his eyes and allowed himself one moment of grief before turning back to duty. Signal the fleet, he said. We are going home. The battered armada limped toward Confederation space, and their holds packed with refugees and their crews exhausted beyond measure. Behind them, the Varak swarm consumed the empty colonies and found nothing to sustain their advance. The humans had denied them their feast, and the galaxy would never look at humanity the same way again. Ambassador Yoon Se-jin entered the War Council chamber with her head held high and her datapad clutched firmly in her hands. The 6-hour recess had ended, and representatives from all 17 species had returned to their platforms, and the air hummed with anticipation. She could feel their eyes on her, and some curious and some dismissive, and others simply impatient to continue with the business of abandoning billions of lives. High Arbiter Thiessen called the session to order, and his luminous skin pulsing with official purple. The Council will now hear any final remarks before we vote on Commander Drovik's defensive strategy. He turned toward the human platform, and his expression conveyed the polite condescension of someone humoring a child. Ambassador Seojin, you requested time to consult with your government, and do you have anything to share with the council? Seojin stood and activated her datapad and projected her display into the center of the chamber. I do. High Arbiter, and humanity wishes to present an alternative proposal. Murmurs rippled through the room, and Commander Drovik's scales shifted to a darker shade that suggested irritation. The council has already determined that evacuation is impossible. He stated with respect, Commander. The council determined that evacuation was impossible using military resources alone. Seojin adjusted her projection, and it showed a fleet of ships unlike anything the council had seen before: cargo haulers and mining vessels and passenger liners and personal craft, and thousands of ships of every size and configuration in the past 6 hours. Earth has mobilized a civilian volunteer fleet, and we currently have over 4,000 ships committed to the evacuation effort. And that number continues to grow. Stunned silence fell over the chamber, and even Thizin's colors flickered with surprise. Civilians? A Nethari delegate buzzed with confusion. Untrained pilots in unarmored vessels? Volunteers. Seojin confirmed, ordinary humans who have chosen to risk their lives for people they have never met. This is madness, Drovik declared, and his forearms gesturing dismissively. Cargo ships cannot withstand Varak's attacks, and your civilians will be slaughtered. Some of them will die, and we know this, and they know this. Seojin's voice remained steady despite the weight of her words. But our calculations show that a combined civilian and military fleet can evacuate approximately 80% of the outer colony populations before the swarm arrives. 80%? A Thracian delegate repeated, and hope creeping into his rumbling voice. His species had colonies in the outer territories, and they had been preparing to mourn billions of their own people. We are requesting Confederation support. Seojin continued. Specifically, we ask that member species provide covering fire during evacuation operations and safe harbor for refugees in core territory. She looked around the chamber and met the eyes of each delegate in turn. We are not asking you to risk your military assets in direct combat with the swarm, and we are only asking that you help us protect the people we managed to rescue. Commander Drovik rose to his full height, and his armored form imposing even across the distance of the chamber. This plan is tactically absurd, and no military strategist would endorse sending untrained civilians into a combat zone. You are correct, Commander, and no military strategist would endorse it. Seojin allowed herself a small smile. But humans are not just military strategists, and we are parents who refuse to abandon children, and neighbors who refuse to watch each other burn, and strangers who become family in moments of crisis. Emotional reasoning, Drovik dismissed. Perhaps, but it is also the reason 4,000 of our people have volunteered to die for your colonies. The chamber fell silent, and Drovik had no response to that simple truth. High Arbiter Thizin's colors shifted through several shades before settling on reluctant orange. Ambassador, even if your civilian fleet reaches the colonies, you lack the firepower to defend them during evacuation, and the Varaks will consume your ships before anyone can escape. We will fight a retreating action, Seojin replied. Our military vessels will engage the swarm while civilian ships load refugees, and we will fall back system by system. You will suffer catastrophic losses. Yes, your fleet will be devastated. Yes, thousands of your people will die. Yes, High Arbiter, and thousands will die so that billions might live. She paused and let those words echo through the chamber. That is the calculation humanity has chosen to make. The delegates exchanged glances, and their translators struggled to convey the complex emotions passing between them. A Species willing to sacrifice itself for others, and not for glory or territory or resources, but simply because it was the right thing to do. This concept did not fit neatly into their understanding of galactic politics. The council requires time to deliberate. Thiessen announced, "We will vote on whether to support the human proposal." "High Arbiter," Seojin interrupted, and her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "I must clarify something." She gathered her materials and tucked her datapad under her arm. "Humanity is not requesting permission to proceed, and we are informing you of our intentions and asking for assistance. You would act without council approval?" A Valari delegate asked with shock in his flickering colors. "The people in those colonies will die in 60 rotations, and I do not have time to wait for 17 species to debate their worth." Seojin stepped down from her platform and walked toward the center of the chamber. "If the Confederation chooses to help, you ask them we welcome your support, and if you choose to maintain your defensive perimeter, then we understand your reasoning." She reached the main floor and turned to face the assembled delegates one final time. "But humanity will not stand by while billions of innocents are consumed, and we cannot and we will not." Ambassador Seojin. Thiessen called out in genuine confusion in his voice. "Where are you going?" "Back to my ship, High Arbiter. And I have an evacuation fleet to coordinate." She walked toward the exit, and her footsteps echoed in the vast chamber. No one spoke, and no one moved, and 17 species watched in stunned silence as the human representative left the War Council without waiting for a vote. The doors closed behind her, and the sound rang through the chamber like a judgment. Commander Dravik was the first to break the silence. "They are insane," he muttered. "Perhaps," High Arbiter Thiessen replied, and his colors shifting to a shade no translator could interpret. "Or perhaps they are something we have forgotten how to be." He turned to address the chamber, and his voice heavy with the weight of centuries. "The Council will vote, and all those in favor of providing support to the human evacuation fleet." The Thracian delegate raised his appendage immediately, and his people were in those colonies, and he would grasp any hope offered. Others followed more slowly, and the Netheri and the Corvin and 3 more species joining the count. But the majority remained still, and the defensive perimeter was safer, and the mathematics were clear, and why risk their own forces for a plan that would probably fail? The motion does not carry. Thiessen announced, "The Confederation will proceed with Commander Dravik's defensive strategy." Somewhere beyond the chamber, Ambassador Seojin was already boarding her shuttle, and humanity was about to face the Varax alone. But the image of her walking out those doors would haunt every delegate in that room for the rest of their lives. They had chosen survival, and the humans had chosen sacrifice, and the galaxy was about to learn which choice truly defined a civilization. Admiral Park Ji-hoon stood in the command center of United Earth. Headquarters and screens surrounded him on every wall, and each one displayed a different feed from human settlements across the Yaos galaxy. His staff moved with urgent efficiency around him, and the hum of activity filled the room like electricity before a storm. "Run the numbers again," he ordered his tactical officer. Lieutenant Commander Sha Minji shook her head, and her dark eyes reflecting the glow of her console. "Sir, I have run them 7 times already, and the answer remains the same." "Tell me anyway." "The Confederation is correct by conventional military logistics," Minji reported. "We have 312 transport vessels capable of the journey, and at maximum capacity, they could evacuate approximately 400 million people. And the outer colonies hold how many? 3.6 billion across 14 worlds." Admiral Park closed his eyes, and the math was brutal. And even if they made multiple trips, there was simply not enough time before the Varax arrived. "What about the other Confederation members?" another officer asked. "Their military transports combined with ours would still fall short." Minji answered, "The Valari have the largest fleet, and even adding their ships we reach perhaps 800 million evacuees. Park turned to the window, and Earth hung in the darkness beyond, and blue and green and beautiful and alive somewhere. Out there, billions of people waited for the galaxy to decide their fate, and 17 species had already written them off as acceptable losses. He could not accept that, and every fiber of his being rejected the cold mathematics of abandonment. There has to be another way, he muttered. Minji hesitated, and her fingers paused above her console. Admiral, there is one possibility, but it falls outside standard military doctrine. I stopped caring about standard doctrine the moment someone suggested we leave billions to die and speak freely. Commander, Minji pulled up a new display, and it showed not military vessels, but a chaotic spread of civilian ships across human space. Cargo haulers, sir, and mining barges and passenger liners and personal craft. She highlighted different categories. As she spoke, and the numbers grew with each edition, if we issued a general call for civilian volunteers, we could potentially mobilize 4,000 to 5,000 additional vessels. Civilians flying into a war zone. Park said slowly, untrained pilots in unarmored ships against the Varak swarm. Yes, sir, and it would be dangerous beyond measure, and people would die in the attempt. But fewer than if we do nothing. Significantly fewer. Admiral, Park turned back to face his staff, and every officer in the room had stopped working, and all eyes were on him. Contact every human colony world, he commanded. I want to know how many civilian ships can be mobilized, and how many volunteers are willing to fly them. Sir, his communications officer spoke up. We cannot order civilians to participate in a military operation. I am not ordering anyone. Lieutenant, and I am asking. He walked to the central console and activated the broadcast system. This is Admiral Park Ji-hoon of United Earth Command speaking to all human settlements. His voice carried across space and through relay stations, and to every corner of human territory. Many of you have heard about the Varak's threat and the Confederation's plan to abandon the outer colonies, and I am contacting you because we have a chance to do something different. He paused and chose his next words carefully. We need ships, and we need pilots, and we need people willing to risk everything to save strangers they have never met. And this is not an order, and I cannot make anyone do this. I am simply telling you that billions of lives hang in the balance, and humanity has a choice to make. The broadcast ended, and Park stood in silence, and the command center felt impossibly quiet. How long until we get responses? He asked. Transmissions to the outer settlements will take several hours. The communications officer replied, the inner colonies should respond within minutes. Those minutes stretched into an eternity, and Park watched the empty screens and wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. Then the first response came, and it was a cargo hauler captain named Kwon Taeyong, operating out of the mining stations near Jupiter, United Earth Command. This is the freighter Eternal Fortune, and my crew and I volunteer for the evacuation mission, and just tell us where to go. Another response followed within seconds, and then another, and then dozens more. Mining crews abandoned profitable asteroid claims, and their ore holds could carry refugees instead of minerals. A luxury cruise company offered their entire fleet of passenger liners and comfort designed for tourists could shelter the desperate and frightened. Families with personal yachts transmitted their coordinates, and elderly couples with small trading vessels and young pilots barely out of flight school. The screens filled with volunteer registrations, and the numbers climbed higher with each passing minute. Admiral, Minji reported with wonder in her voice. We have over 800 confirmed volunteers in the first hour alone. Park watched the responses pour in and felt something tighten in his chest. These were not soldiers, and they had no obligation to fight, and no duty that compelled them to die for people they would never know. Yet here they were, and thousands of ordinary humans stepping forward to face the darkness. His secure console chimed, and a priority message from Ambassador Seo-jin appeared. Admiral, the council reconvenes in 2 hours, and what should I tell them? Park looked at the volunteer numbers one more time, and they had passed 1,000 and continued climbing. He began typing his response, and each word carried the weight of the decision he was making. Tell them that humanity has a counter-proposal, and tell them we are coming whether they help us or not. He sent the message and turned to address his staff. Begin coordinating fleet assembly points, and I want logistics. Plans for fuel and supplies and medical support, and we launch in 48 hours. Sir. His executive officer spoke carefully. Many of these civilian ships have no weapons and no armor and no military-grade shields. I know. Casualties could be catastrophic. I know that too, Commander. Park straightened his uniform and said, his jaw with determination. But I also know that every species in that council chamber looked at billions of innocent lives and decided they were not worth saving. I refuse to be the kind of leader who makes that calculation, and I refuse to let humanity be remembered as the species that stood by and watched. His staff stared at him, and the weight of his words settled over the room. The galaxy thinks we are primitive and violent and barely civilized, and perhaps they are right about some of those things, but they are about to learn something else about humans. They are about to learn that we do not abandon people, and not our own and not anyone else. He walked toward the door and paused at the threshold. Get me a ship. Commander, because I am going to lead this fleet personally. The command center erupted into activity behind him, and Park stepped into the corridor, and the faces of his ancestors seemed to watch him from the walls. He thought of his grandfather, who had survived a war, and his mother who had pioneered fusion technology, and his daughter, who dreamed of exploring distant stars. They had all fought for something greater than themselves, and now it was his turn. The volunteer count passed 2,000 and the fleet was taking shape, and somewhere in the darkness the Vorax swarm continued its relentless advance. But so did humanity, and for the first time since the crisis began, Park allowed himself to feel something like hope. The galaxy had written off those colonies, and the mathematics of cold logic had condemned billions to death. But mathematics had never accounted for the human heart, and that was about to change everything. The emergency signal had reached every corner of the galaxy within hours, and Ambassador Yoon Seojin had never seen the Confederation move so quickly in her 12 years of service. She stood at the viewport of the diplomatic shuttle as Nexus Prime came into view, and the massive station hung in the void like a silver flower with its 17 docking arms extended in all directions. Ambassador, we are cleared for approach, her aide, Lieutenant Bei Sunwoo, announced from the pilot seat. Seojin nodded without turning from the window, and she could already see dozens of ships from various species converging on the station. The Vorax swarm had finally done what centuries of diplomatic disputes could not, and they had united the Confederation in genuine terror. She had read the intelligence reports during the journey, and the images still haunted her thoughts. Entire planets stripped bare and billions of lives consumed, and nothing left behind but dead rock floating in space. The Vorax did not conquer or negotiate or demand surrender, and they simply devoured everything in their path, like a plague of locusts crossing the stars. How many confirmed casualties so far? She asked. Sunwoo checked his datapad, and his face grew pale as he read the numbers. 14 billion across 6 systems. Ambassador, and the outer colonies are directly in their projected path. Seojin closed her eyes for a moment, and 14 billion souls already gone, and how many more would follow if the Confederation could not find a way to stop this threat? The shuttle docked smoothly, and Seojin straightened her formal uniform before stepping into the station. Nexus Prime had been built 3,000 years ago as neutral ground where all species could meet, and its corridors were designed to accommodate beings of every size and shape. She passed a group of Volari diplomats gliding on their tentacles, and their luminous skin flickering with colors that conveyed emotions. Humans could only guess at a Kethri warrior stood guard at an intersection, and his forearms crossed over his armored chest, and his reptilian eyes tracking every movement in the corridor. Humanity was still the newcomer here and admitted to the Confederation only 12 cycles ago, after proving they could travel between stars without destroying themselves. Most species still viewed humans as primitive and violent and barely worth acknowledging in council chambers. Seojin had spent her entire career trying to change that perception, and today she would discover just how far she had come. The War Council chamber occupied the central hub of the station, and it was a vast circular room with elevated platforms arranged in tiers. Each platform was designed for a specific species with appropriate atmosphere and gravity and temperature controls. Seojin took her place on the human platform, and she was positioned near the outer edge of the chamber as befitting their junior status. She counted representatives from 17 species as the chamber filled, and this was the largest gathering she had ever witnessed. High Arbiter Thiessen of the Velari rose from his platform at the center, and his body shimmered with deep purple hues that signified grave concern. "We are gathered because our civilization faces extinction," he announced, and his voice was translated instantly through the chamber systems. "The Varak swarm has breached our outer territories, and they advance toward the core systems with each passing rotation." A holographic display activated above the chamber, and it showed the galaxy with the Varaks. Incursion marked in angry red. The swarm's path cut directly through the most populated regions of the outer territories, and dozens of colony worlds lay in their way. Our military analysts project that the swarm will reach the first populated systems within 60 rotations. Thiessen continued, "We must determine our response before it is too late." Military Commander Drovik of the Kethri rose next, and his scales gleamed under the chamber lights as he activated his own display. "I have consulted with strategic experts from every member species," he declared. "We have one viable option for preserving the Confederation." The hologram shifted to show a defensive line drawn across the mid-territories, and everything beyond that line was shaded in gray. "We establish a defensive perimeter here, and we concentrate all military assets along this boundary, and we hold the line against the swarm." Murmurs rippled through the chamber, and Seojin felt her stomach tighten as she studied the projection. "Commander," a Nethery delegate called out, and her insectoid wings buzzing with agitation, "your perimeter abandons the outer colonies entirely." "That is correct," Drovik replied without emotion. "The mathematics are clear, and we cannot defend everything. And we must sacrifice the outer systems to protect the core." "You speak of billions of lives," another delegate protested. "I speak of survival," Drovik countered. "If we spread our forces thin trying to protect every world, then we protect nothing, and the swarm consumes us all." Seojin listened as the debate continued, and one by one the other species voiced their concerns and their fears, and ultimately their agreement. The Velari supported the plan, and the Nethari reluctantly conceded, and even the Thracians, who had colonies in the outer territories, accepted the cold logic of abandonment. When her turn came to speak, Seojin stood slowly, and every eye in the chamber turned toward the human representative. "I have a question," she said, and her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "What resources would be needed to evacuate the outer colonies, instead of abandoning them?" Silence fell over the chamber, and several delegates exchanged glances that clearly conveyed their opinion of the naive human. High Arbiter Thiessen responded with patience in his voice, as if explaining something to a child. "Ambassador Seojin, evacuation is mathematically impossible given the time frame and our available transport vessels. With respect, High Arbiter, I asked what would be needed and not whether it was possible by current standards." Commander Drovik made a sound that his translator rendered as dismissive laughter. "You would need 10,000 transport ships at minimum and crews willing to fly into the path of the swarm, and a logistics network that does not exist." "Thank you, Commander," Seojin replied. "I request a recess to consult with my government." Thiessen's colors shifted to mild surprise, but he granted the request and the council would reconvene in 6 standard hours. As the delegates dispersed, Seojin caught fragments of conversation, and none of it was flattering. The humans do not understand galactic warfare. A Valari whispered, "They are too young and too emotional." A Kethri agreed. "They will learn," a Netheri added, "or they will perish with the rest of us." Sajin ignored them all, and she walked back to her shuttle with purpose in every step. She had 6 hours to do something that 17 species had declared impossible, and she had no intention of wasting a single minute. Lieutenant Bay, she called as she boarded the ship. "Establish a priority connection to United Earth Command, and I need to speak with Admiral Park immediately." Sunwoo's fingers flew across the console, and within moments, the face of Admiral Park Ji-hoon appeared. On the screen, his gray hair was disheveled, and his uniform jacket was unfastened, and he had clearly been pulled from sleep. "Ambassador, what is the situation?" he asked. Seojin took a deep breath and began to explain, and as she spoke, she watched the Admiral's expression change from confusion to concern to something she had not expected. She saw determination in his eyes and the same stubborn refusal to accept the unacceptable that had driven humanity to the stars in the first place. "Give me 3 hours," Park said when she finished. "I need to make some calls." The screen went dark, and Seojin sat in the empty shuttle, and she wondered if she had just started something magnificent or something catastrophic. Either way, humanity was about to show the galaxy exactly what they were made of.